UConn is one of college basketball's great enigmas. Legendary figures like Jim Calhoun and Ray Allen litter the annals of Husky history. Their breakthrough to the big time was so late, though, that many consider them a second-tier program, despite the repeated success. Pore through the history books, and you'll see that these people couldn't be more wrong. Connecticut is dripping with passion, tradition, and a desire for recognition. This is UConn, college basketball's newest blue blood. Around the turn of the century, basketball was treated as a sideshow, a game with few implications beyond having some fun. It's with this mentality that you have to contextualize the earliest days of UConn basketball. The first game, a 17-12 victory over Willimantic High, was played sometime around February of 1901. Seriously, that's as specific as it gets. Not only that, it was played on the road because the college had no gymnasium or the money to build one. They didn't even play a college team until 1905, and when they did, Massachusetts so thoroughly dismantled them that they abandoned the season altogether after just one more game. 3 years flew by before they recorded their first collegiate win, a late-season clash over Rhode Island, but it would prove a rather unfortunate time to finally find a breakthrough. No longer able to financially support the ever-growing needs of the Big Three sports, with an increasing number of students evading the $5 athletic fee, the Connecticut hierarchy had to find a more scaled-back path forward. For 1908 and 9, they decided that this vision for the future must not include basketball. Mind you, this did not spell disaster for basketball at the college. While they were not interested in handing out their $5 for it, the student body did still love the game. In a primitive version of intramural sports, the classes formed their own teams, playing one another and keeping the spirit of the game alive in stores. Their show of support would not be enough to bring varsity basketball back to Connecticut, though. The next year, the Athletics Association once again declined to sponsor basketball, this time claiming that, due to the inadequate facilities on campus, their boys were ill-equipped to face competition of requisite strength. Truthfully, they were right. The tight quarters of Connecticut's court put them at a serious disadvantage. Regulation courts, in place at nearly all of their opponents' gyms, were significantly larger, and the courts favored an open game that they couldn't simulate in practice, leading to frequent and embarrassing losses. The basketball-crazed students would respond again, though, forming the CAC Independents from the best of their class teams and scheduling many of the high schools that had previously made up the bulk of their schedule anyway. The independent team would prove to be the solution most amenable to both sides. Under the condition that they would continue to pay their own way, the Athletics Association agreed to recognize them as the official Connecticut basketball team. In name, this meant that they were now proper representatives of their institution, restored at last, but in practice, very little changed. The schedule certainly didn't change, continuing to play local preps instead of their peers around New England. The team still had no coach, no gym, and little money, but they would scrape by just long enough to see revolutionary change. In 1913, the Connecticut State House allocated $60,000 for the construction of a new armory to house the school's ROTC program, which had until then lacked a stable home during Storr's brutal New England winters. As a bonus, the soon-to-be-named Hawley Armory's main hall would double as a gymnasium, finally removing one of the biggest impediments to the return of varsity basketball. A new gym in the works, the Independents were scrapped for the 13-14 season as groundwork was laid for the new team. Though construction was not scheduled for completion until February of 1915, the Connecticut Athletics Association intended to resume basketball as quickly as possible. A team and an abbreviated schedule were assembled, rather haphazardly in retrospect, for the 1915 season, and hoops finally returned to Storrs. Or did it? Sure, a contest with New Hampshire marked a return to intercollegiate play, but that game, a resounding loss, had to be played in Willimantic. There was also a matchup with the Yale JVs, but similarly, it was played and lost in Hartford. The failure of 1915 proved to be so embarrassing, in fact, that it fundamentally changed the direction of the program. For 1916, Connecticut, now known as the Aggies, brought in the first basketball coach in program history, John Donahue. As with many minor athletic figures of the era, Donahue's career, including his time at the university, is sparingly documented. We know he also coached football, albeit poorly while at Connecticut, but not much beyond that. Thankfully, you can separate his poor football coaching skill from his ability as an administrator. On Donahue's watch, Aggie athletics went from a gleeful pastime to a serious competitive endeavor. In his debut football season in 1915, the university played its first ever all-collegiate schedule. Not only that, his basketball team followed suit, falling in line with the major powers of New England. This move would lend legitimacy to the Aggies in a way they'd never had before. Though Donahue himself wouldn't be around to see the fruits of his labor, with World War I derailing his teams and bringing to an end his tenure at Connecticut, the foundation he laid would soon become evident. Spearheaded by newly installed athletics director Roy Geyer, Connecticut quickly began to find its footing again. The steady hand of Ross Swartz, Geyer's first hire as AD, stabilized the basketball team, returning them to their traditional 500 status. But Swartz's tenure would be brief, as he, like his predecessor, proved a poor football coach. Appointed in 1912, Wilder Tasker had the privilege of carrying on Swartz's work. Utilizing the reputation restored by Swartz, Tasker scheduled aggressively for his first season, giving his new players the chance to prove that they could run with the big dogs. And they came through in a big way. With marquee victories over Harvard, Army, and Brown to open the season, Connecticut finished the year 15-4 and dubbed themselves champions of New England. Long mired in instability, the luster of success quickly faded into a moment of panic when, after a blowout loss to open the season against Army, Tasker tendered his resignation, intent on assuming the same role at William and Mary the following year. Connecticut, it seemed, was doomed to float through the years aimlessly, bouncing from coach to coach and never really finding a springboard into the next level. Much of the following 2 decades was spent doing just that. 6 different men led the team between Tasker and the Second World War. Were it not for the creation of the New England Conference, the fans may have found no respite at all. Unlikely to gain national relevance, at least in the way their urban peers had, the small conference made up of Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maine, and later Northeastern gave the team something to fight for. Over this period, they won 6 New England Conference championships and created a culture of success that would snowball into something far larger. This snowball would be embodied by Hugh Greer. Greer, a Connecticut native, played on the first 2 New England Conference champions at UConn, as it was now known, even captaining the 1926 team as a senior. In stores, winning became more than a reward for Greer. Winning became an expectation, a habit even. Not long after graduation, Greer took jobs at Glastonbury and Manchester High, each time impressing enough to land him the job at Ellsworth Memorial, where his winning habit would fully shine through. Over an 11-year stint at Ellsworth, Greer won 5 titles, logged 3 winning streaks of 30 games or more, and became the all-time winningest coach in Connecticut high school history. Only when an opportunity to coach the freshman team at his alma mater arose in 1946 did his grip on power loosen, but soon that opportunity would catapult him to new heights. On December 20th, 1946, after mere months with the freshman club, UConn head coach Blair Guillaume resigned his position to take the AD job at Washington University. League play in the new Yankee Conference already underway, George Van Bibber, then AD at UConn, needed to fill the seat quickly. Who better, he thought, than a UConn-playing legend who was already in the building and familiar with the team's personnel, tactics, and opponents. Coach Guillaume even went so far as to say, "I don't feel as badly about leaving as I might if Mr. Greer were not here to carry on." Inheriting a 3-1 ball club, Greer's Huskies split his first 2 games, then went on a historic tear, decimating nearly every team that stood in their way. Of their 12 remaining opponents, only Army, Yale, and Rhode Island kept it within 10. They would fall victim to unbalanced scheduling in the end, being beaten to the Yankee title by a Vermont team who played just 1 conference game, but the statement of intent was made. UConn carried that momentum into the next year, rounding out the non-conference warm-ups at 6-3, and would be further bolstered when in January of '48 the new Storrs Cage opened. An unassuming mass of sheet metal and steel assembled from surplus air hangar material left over from the World War, again thanks to the UConn ROTC, its impact on basketball went beyond the building. Thanks to its 4,000-seat capacity, UConn could for the first time welcome the general public into its basketball games, selling tickets and generating revenue to further improve its station. It helped, of course, that Greer's men played such an attractive brand of ball, high-octane defense, attacking the lanes, subbing so that players could stay fresh, but winning was the motivation, and Greer was a serial winner. By the end of the 1948 season, Greer had lifted his first Yankee title. In '49, they repeated the feat. In '50, they came up 1 game short, and in '51, yet another fortuitous circumstance would put UConn in the national spotlight. Since its inception in 1939, the NCAA basketball tournament had featured 8 teams. Most years that never caused a problem. There weren't many schools fielding basketball at a strong competitive standard, and it was mostly a regionalized game, so it was easy to identify the best teams to award a berth. In 1950, that all changed. Thanks to the arrival of Indiana high school legend Everett Case at North Carolina State in '46, the Southern Conference, whose power schools later split to form the ACC, had caught the basketball bug. Massive palaces like NC State's 12,000-seat Reynolds Coliseum were being erected across the Southeast, and Tobacco Road was starting to bare its teeth. Meanwhile, Kentucky, under the leadership of Adolph Rupp, was still dominating the SEC. This left two powerhouse programs for one Southern bid to the NCAA Tournament. After Rupp outright refused to play a playoff game for the bid, reasoning that his third-ranked squad should be given priority over Case's fifth-ranked squad, the NCAA awarded the bid to NC State and set in motion the first expansion to the NCAA Tournament. One of the knock-on effects of the new tournament, now featuring 16 teams, was that with a bid all but guaranteed to the Ivy League champion, someone had to win the vacated East at-large spot. And Greer was damn good at winning. The Huskies stormed out to a 15-3 start, then won their final 7 in a row, including a title decider over Rhode Island. When Holy Cross refused to play a play-in game, UConn was awarded the tournament bid outright, their first in program history, and would be scheduled to meet championship contender St. John's in Madison Square Garden. In front of 18,000 fans, the hometown Red Men prevailed, but not all was lost. UConn, the only officially designated small college in the field, benefited from this appearance in the same way a small college does now. Recruiting ticked up. Greer came to be a major player in the New York City recruiting scene, especially after a betting scandal embroiled the city schools later in '51. Revenue increased. The people of Connecticut foamed at the mouth to get in the cage and see UConn play. Most importantly, facilities improved. Plans were drawn up for a field house, a new 4,600-seat permanent home for UConn basketball, set to be completed for the 54-55 season. And Greer harnessed this momentum to perfection. He started by making sure everyone knew the Yankee Conference ran through stores. Even if they were left out of the tournament, as they were in '52 and '53, it wouldn't be because they weren't conference champions. When the tournament expanded again in '53, this time to 22, the postseason would become his God-given right. By the end of the decade, UConn had won 10 straight Yankee titles, 12 out of 13, and made 7 straight postseasons, 1 trip to the NIT, and 6 NCAAs. They even logged the school's first postseason win in any sport in 1956, beating Manhattan to advance to the round of 16. Only something catastrophic could end Greer's run at the pinnacle of New England basketball, and in the tradition of UConn, that's exactly what happened. In 1961, Greer posted the first losing season of his entire coaching career. His team, 11-13, had 2 players, center Glenn Cross, who had played high school ball with Greer's son, and team captain Pete Kelly accepting bribes to shave points. Much like the betting scandal that had rocked New York basketball and allowed him to pluck their talent with impunity, this would ruin careers, and Greer was right in the crosshairs. The '62 team again lost out on the Yankee title, dropping it by 1 game to UMass despite having beaten them twice, and it was clear for all to see that once the iron grip had been relinquished, there was no way to get it back. In 1963, tragically, his UConn career would come to an end when, after a squash game with assistant coach George Wigton, Greer had a massive heart attack in his store's home. Left with enormous shoes to fill, an unenviable task at best, J.O. Christian named Wigton interim coach and kicked the can down the road. Wigton performed admirably in his new role, restoring the Huskies to Yankee Conference glory and earning another NCAA tournament berth. Christian, though, decided to go another direction, favoring up-and-comer Fred Shabel, Vic Bubas' top assistant from Duke's 1963 Final Four team. Shabel largely justified Christian's decision. In his first season, he led UConn as far as it had ever gone in the tournament, getting all the way to the quarterfinals before running into who else but Bubas and Duke. He again made the tournament in '65 and was set to do so in '66 before losing a single-game playoff to arch-rivals Rhode Island for the conference crown. After making one last tournament in '67, Shabel decided coaching wasn't for him anymore, and what followed was a decade of futility. Having won just one conference championship in the dying days of the Yankee Conference, which transitioned to a football-only league in '76, UConn turned independent with the optimism of the Greer era long in the rear view. All the while, the NCAA was waging war on independent schools, reserving new auto bids in an expanded 32-team tournament, just for conference tournament champions. With no traditional conferences besides the Ivy League, the fear of a relegation to irrelevance spread like wildfire across the Northeast. The ADs at 4 preeminent basketball powers, Syracuse, Providence, St. John's, and Georgetown, decided to take things into their own hands. Searching far and wide for schools that fit their criteria of new TV markets and exceptional basketball history, these ADs landed on Boston College, Rutgers, and UConn. After Rutgers declined, unwilling to separate itself from fellow Atlantic 8 member Penn State, they added Seton Hall, and in 1979, the Big East was born. After Villanova joined in 1980, the Big East began to show itself as one of the standout conferences in the whole sport. In 1982, Georgetown represented the conference in its first ever Final Four, being pipped for a national championship on a last-minute shot from North Carolina freshman Michael Jordan. Georgetown and star Patrick Ewing's moment would come, though, and in 1984, the Hoyas logged the first ever Big East national championship. Even more conference jubilation would come the next year, when the league sent 3 teams, Villanova, Georgetown, and St. John's, to the Final Four and locked out the national championship game. On national TV seemingly every night thanks to a shrewd deal with 24-hour sports network ESPN, the Big East was riding as high goes. UConn, however, was not having so much fun. Early under Coach Don Perno, the Huskies were a fine team, occasionally appearing in the NIT and making it once to the NCAA Tournament. But they were never serious players in the Big East. Their best finish, a 3-way tie for third place in '81, didn't even see them advance past the first round of the conference tournament, and after that, performances got increasingly worse. Despite 3 straight seasons under 500 in '83, '4, and '5, Perno managed to survive, perhaps living off his name as a player on Coach Shabel's Elite 8 team. But in '86, the wheels fell off. After an embarrassing thrashing at the hands of Northeastern in Hartford, and with the construction of a new arena on the horizon, it became clear that change was in the air. Longtime AD John Toner had toiled for years for a new arena, one suitable for a program of their station, but saw his vision pushed back over a decade by design and funding issues. He would not let it fall at the final hurdle because the team stunk, though. When Perno tendered his resignation in April of 1986, Toner launched an expansive national search, just like he had in '85 when hiring future Hall of Famer Gino Auriemma to coach the women's program. The answer, however, was in his own backyard. As it turned out, the very same coach who had embarrassed them so thoroughly in December, Northeastern's Jim Calhoun, was looking for a new challenge. Calhoun had overseen Northeastern's transition from Division II and built something of a regional monster. Over their first 7 years as a D1, they missed the tournament only twice, dominating small college Northeast basketball, much in the same way UConn had only 30 years before. Even better, Calhoun had proven his recruiting prowess, bringing Reggie Lewis from Baltimore's Dunbar High, then the #1 team in the country, all the way to Boston. Perno had been a poor recruiter, every year watching some of the state's premier players depart for Villanova. John Pannone, Harold Presley, and Harold Jensen had all been major contributors to the Wildcats' Final Four runs, and it was imperative that these players stayed home. On May 14, 1986, Calhoun was officially named head coach at UConn, and the long road back began anew. To say year 1 was a disappointment would be an understatement. Hamstrung by the roster construction of a failed coach, the Huskies couldn't wait to get to the end of the season. Reprieve simply wouldn't come, though, as in '88 they once again finished bottom of the Big East, a 3rd successive wooden spoon. Thanks to their non-conference performances, UConn did receive an invite to the NIT, and it was there, in MSG, that the legend of Jim Calhoun began to bloom. Frenetic and hard-nosed, the Huskies raced through the early rounds. After facing the gauntlet that was the Big East, West Virginia, Louisiana Tech, and VCU might as well have been the schools for the blind. The last weekend proved no match either, as multi-possession wins over conference mate Boston College and Ohio State sent the Huskies back to stores with the first postseason trophy in school history. Like the great coaches of yesteryear, all Calhoun really needed to get started was one little taste of success. Soon the Huskies added Chris Smith, a blue-chip guard from right down the road in Bridgeport who opted to sign with UConn over reigning Big East runners-up Syracuse. Smith represented a major coup for Calhoun. UConn needed NBA development proof of concept for the elite high school players in the area, and Smith, a shifty guard with incredible shooting prowess, exuded league potential. Slowly, the signs of progress shone through. In '89, they finally crawled off the bottom of the conference, finishing 3 games above last-place Boston College. Finally betting in his own players, Calhoun added 2 more key pieces for 1990. Reasserting his control over his home territory, he managed to convince highly touted multisport athlete Scott Burrell to issue a baseball scholarship to Miami in favor of playing basketball in the blue and white. Calhoun also, rather fortuitously, displayed an impressive grasp over all things outside their borders. Landing Israeli prospect Nadav Hennefeld after an unsatisfying visit to St. John's led him to take a detour to Storrs, the closest Big East school nearby, where he fell in love with the college town atmosphere. Together with Chris Smith and some talented holdovers, namely Newark's Tate George and Morgan Wooten disciple John Gwynn, they would be the founding fathers of a new revolution. Battling back from a season opener loss to Texas A&M in Alaska, the 1990 Huskies swept the entirety of their remaining non-conference slate, boasting wins over tournament regulars Auburn, Florida State, and Maryland. The stage was set, it seemed, for a historic run, before a loss to Villanova and a blowout on the road against top 25 St. John's let pessimism slowly creep back in. It was not the same old UConn, though. Rattling off 3 quick wins over Pitt, Villanova, and Seton Hall, the Huskies returned for a massive homestand in Hartford, welcoming 2 top 5 teams in 1 week. Buoyed by 17 from Smith, UConn steamrolled number 5 Syracuse and set up a prove-it game against the Big East Kings, John Thompson's Georgetown Hoyas. Georgetown, led by 1988 High School Player of the Year Alonzo Mourning and 7'2" shot-blocking machine Dikembe Mutombo, were undefeated and ranked the second-best team in the nation. Though the UConn centers tallied only 6 points and 1 rebound between them, a fantastic showing from Hennefeld and Gwynn pushed the Huskies over the top, and from there it was game on. The campus alive with Husky spirit, and pushed to their limit by the opening of the new 8,000-seat Gamble Pavilion, UConn lost only twice more, earning their first ever top 5 ranking and Big East regular season title. At MSG, it was more of the same. A dominant win over Seton Hall in the opening round set the tone for 2 rematch victories over Georgetown and Syracuse, clinching the school's first Big East title. An unprecedented run, Calhoun, after a decent but not good 3-year start, had taken the program to the stratosphere in year 4, and they weren't done yet. Given their first number 1 seed in the NCAA Tournament, UConn got the chance to level their first weekend opponents in front of a home crowd, notching 20-point wins over BU and Cal in front of 16,000 in Hartford. It wasn't until the Sweet 16 that things got interesting. Shock champions of the ACC, a feat they had never before and have never since accomplished, Clemson were tourney darlings, just like the Huskies. For most of the game, it was a mauling. UConn built a lead as large as 19 midway through the second half, but as with their entire history, things were never easy. Clemson stormed back, smothering defense, holding UConn scoreless from the field over the last 6 minutes, and hit a late 3 to take a 70-69 lead with just 12 seconds to play. Though the Huskies set up a good look for Tate George, he missed the 15-footer, and UConn sent Sean Tyson to the foul line with 1.6 to go. A 58% free throw shooter, Tyson smoked the front end of the 1-and-1, leaving UConn with the ball and 1.0 on the clock. Scott Burrell's full-court inbound heave found George again, and this time the shot struck true, sending the 19,500 fans into rapture. The shot, as it's known in UConn circles, can be viewed as the unofficial welcome to the big time for Connecticut basketball. The elation would be cut short later that weekend when Duke's Christian Laettner hit them back with a buzzer beater of his own, but Husky mania had already set in. That 1990 team set the standard throughout the rest of the decade. Calhoun brought All-Americans, NBA studs, and Big East killers to Storrs. Donyell Marshall, Kevin Ollie, Ray Allen, Rip Hamilton, Khalid El-Amin. The Husky faithful were treated to some of the game's best, and they responded in kind, packing Gamble Pavilion and making it one of the hardest places to play in the entire country. This symbiotic relationship fed the program, now the preeminent force in the Big East, taking home 4 tournament titles and 6 regular season titles during this decade. A culture of winning reinstated, UConn continued their climb. By November of 1998, Calhoun's men had finally ascended the mountain, at last ranked number 1, a feat that had proved elusive despite a decade of dominance in one of basketball's premier conferences. And the Huskies set out to prove they were deserving. Losing just twice, both times to top 25 teams, UConn cruised to a Big East regular season title. Then, after weathering a first-round scare against Seton Hall, won the tournament title on autopilot. Again awarded a number 1 seed, UConn crushed their 16-9, fulfilling their second weekend destiny with ease. Behind 2 21-point games from Rip Hamilton, they pushed through the second weekend comfortably as well. This UConn team looked as if it may finally be the one, rising to the occasion to reach the school's first ever Final Four. Behind another 20-point outing from Rip Hamilton, they made the national championship game. And who else awaited them but the Duke Blue Devils, the same team that had twice ended their season in the Elite Eight. Entering the game as 9.5-point underdogs, it was widely agreed that UConn stood little chance. No team with odds that long had ever won a national championship. Duke had a Super Five, all expected to be NBA talents, not too dissimilar from today. Connecticut, on the other hand, had Rip Hamilton, a likely lottery pick in 1999's NBA draft, and a couple second-round flyers. It was a fever dream, but Calhoun's enigmatic personality had the whole team pulling in the same direction. Hamilton and Duke star Trajan Langdon traded haymakers, never able to separate their teams by more than 6 points in a game that went all the way to the wire. With a minute and a half on the clock, Langdon hit a huge three to cut the UConn lead down to 1, paving the way for a chaotic endgame. The teams traded baskets to make it 75-74, and with 25 seconds left to play, Duke had the ball in their superstars' hands with a chance to win the game. Now under 10, Langdon isolated guard Ricky Moore, who despite a quick crossover held his ground on the right-sided drive and forced the longer Langdon off balance. 2 made free throws from Elamine, and a defensive stand on a desperation heave later, Jim Nantz uttered the immortal words.
You gotta believe, because just when people say you can't, you can, and UConn has won the national championship.
High-level success came to define Calhoun's tenure. In 2004, led by Ben Gordon and Emeka Okafor, he won again, despite another scare against Duke. In 2009, the Huskies and superstar Hasheem Thabeet went on a vengeful run back to the Final Four, but came up short against Michigan State. As the 2010s drew nearer, though, things began to look bleak. The Big East had seriously bloated. Turning to football to stabilize the conference had not paid off. The premier football members, VT, Miami, and BC, had been pillaged by the ACC, and replacing them with all-sports members Louisville, Cincinnati, USF, Marquette, and DePaul seriously detracted from the mythical basketball-forward status the conference once held. After an 11th place finish in 2011, it would take a miracle to get back to the top of the mountain. They got one. In front of capacity crowds in MSG, Kemba Walker dazzled. The stereotypical swagger of a New York guard contagious, the whole team, maybe the whole country, rallied around the diminutive Walker as he hit big shot after big shot. They just kept winning. Close game with the 1 seed, Walker answered with one of the most iconic shots of all time. Overtime against nationally ranked Syracuse. Walker hung 33 and 12 in a banner night. Conference championship game against Rick Pitino in Louisville, Walker hit 2 late free throws to help ice it. 5 games in 5 days, it was one of the most improbable, inexplicable moments in the history of college basketball. And it wasn't over. Powering the 3-seeded Huskies, Walker gave them a double-double in round 1, 33 in round 2, 36 against Kawhi Leonard in the Sweet 16, a step-back dagger with a minute to go in the Elite Eight, and a last-second defensive stand on Brandon Knight in the Final Four. Out of nowhere, Calhoun had made his 3rd national championship game. Hollywood wouldn't even write this story. Nobody would believe it. A 5'11" guard from the Bronx, possessed by Michael Jordan himself, taking on the entire country and winning? The national championship game even set up perfectly for them, when 8-seed Butler, who had lost Gordon Hayward to the 2010 draft, downed Shaka Smart in the Final Four. No more heroics left in him, Kemba nearly shot them out of a national championship, going 5 for 19 from the floor. But the defense held tight, and UConn was going home with a 3rd set of rings. After coming down from the title high, that bleak feeling started to peak out again. At the end of the 2011 season, the NCAA handed down a significant punishment to Calhoun and the Huskies for major recruiting violations. Calhoun was suspended 3 games, UConn scholarships were reduced, and the institution was given 3 years of probation. Calhoun, now in his twilight years, was also experiencing a bout of health issues, including spinal stenosis, leading him to missing several games in 2012 on his own accord. When it became clear that the team would be banned from the postseason for violating APR standards, and with the Big East torn apart, Jim Calhoun retired as head coach of the Connecticut Huskies. 18 tournament appearances, 10 Big East regular season titles, 7 tournament titles, 4 Final Fours, and 3 national championships, Calhoun left behind a gargantuan legacy. He built UConn into a major national brand, and now it would be up to his assistant and former player Kevin Ollie to fill those shoes. Year 1 of the Ollie era was a write-off. All they needed was to smoothly transition out of the Big East, whose non-FBS football-playing members would be continuing under the Big East branding, and into the new American Conference. And that's exactly what happened. No fuss, no fights, a 20-win season, and getting the ship righted for year one in the new league. Things went about as well as you could hope for in year two. Ollie took UConn back out of the basement, finishing third in the New American, winning 4 top 25 games and making it all the way to the conference championship game before bowing out to reigning national champions Louisville. A good showing in March was all they needed to show the fans that it would all stay on track without Calhoun. Nearly recording a triple-double in an overtime win over St. Joe's in round one, Shabel Napier, one of the last members of the last championship team, carried UConn over the line. Against Villanova, Napier did it again, raining down 25 on the 6th-ranked Wildcats. An undersized Northeastern guard hitting a once-in-a-generation hot streak in March surely couldn't happen twice in 4 years, right? Wrong. 19 against Iowa State, 25 against Michigan State, a 4-steal defensive cornerstone game against number 1 Florida. It all screamed Kemba Walker. Again, they met an unranked team in the final when Kentucky upset Frank Kaminsky and Wisconsin in the Final Four. But with serious one-and-done NBA talent on the roster, there would be no room for an off night from their superstar. And they didn't get one. 22 points, 6 rebounds, 6 assists, 3 steals. Napier lit up Kentucky, and now, under a second coach, UConn was cutting down the nets. There's a saying that the brightest stars burn the fastest, and that's the perfect analogy for the Ollie era at UConn. A national champion in his first year eligible for the postseason, he would accomplish little else. By winning the 2016 American Tournament, he hung another banner, but a hollow one, as they failed to advance to the second weekend. In 2018, the NCAA came back to town, charging Ollie with a litany of recruiting violations and finally putting an end to his tenure in Storrs. He would depart as one of the greatest what-if stories in college basketball. He accomplished so much with a team that truly should not have been capable of winning a national championship, but the weight of expectation and the failings of the American as a basketball league suffocated his program. Now free from the shadow of Jim Calhoun, AD Dave Benedict could go right back to the original playbook that made Calhoun so attractive to UConn in the first place. Benedict needed someone with knowledge of Northeast basketball and an experience revitalizing a program. Enter Rhode Island head coach Dan Hurley. Hurley played point guard at Seton Hall and thus had a deep understanding of the traditional New England programs. He built St. Benedict's Prep into a nationally relevant high school program, Wagner into Northeast Conference contenders, and took URI from A10 doormat to A10 champions. He checked all the boxes, and for Benedict, it was an easy call. Much like Ollie, Hurley had to deal with the cloud of the NCAA hanging over his head in year one. No matter, though, the focus for UConn was on undoing everything that had happened over the previous decade. The most obvious step, announced the summer following the season, was the transition back to the Big East. All of UConn's best days were playing in a league with traditional partners in their traditional market, not traveling to Memphis on Thursday and New Orleans on Saturday. The Huskies still had to play out one final season in the American, though, battling to a 5th-place finish and a second successive improvement under Hurley, before COVID-19 shut the entire season down. Abruptly, their most prominent problem had come to an end, and all Hurley had left to do was what he'd done best: breathe some competitive fire back into a basketball program. Knowing the success his predecessors had found recruiting the major metros in the Big East footprint, Hurley, himself a former New York area prep coach, launched a full-court press on the trail. His first full recruiting class had brought in Brooklyn-born star James Bouknight, and he was only the beginning. Adama Sinogo, a New Jersey prep stud, Jordan Hawkins, a standout DeMatha guard, and Donovan Clingan, an imposing 7-footer from Bristol, right in his backyard, Hurley put together teams that understood what it meant to be a Big East player. And he was rewarded. In 2021, the Huskies broke a 4-year skid, finally returning to the NCAA Tournament. In 2022, they logged their first repeat appearance in a decade. And in 2023, Hurley's blue and white renaissance finally showed the bite to match its bark. Logging a perfect 11-0 record in the non-conference, UConn entered Big East play ranked 3rd in the country. But nothing is ever easy in Storrs. Despite great play from Hawkins, Sinogo, and Clingan, UConn limped through the Big East season, splitting their 10 road games 5-5 and failing to win a single one-possession game. No matter, though, that was the nature of the Big East, and the pollsters recognized that, ranking the Huskies 11th entering the conference tournament. Though their trip to MSG ran short at the hands of Marquette, another one-possession loss, there was reason for optimism nonetheless. UConn was the only program to place 2, Sinogo and Hawkins, on the All-Big East first team, and placed 2, Clingan and Caravan, on the All-Freshman team just for good measure. They had the talent to do anything. That much was obvious. They just needed a classic UConn March run to back that up. To call what happened anything less than that would be a disservice. UConn obliterated every team that stood in their way. No heroics or miracle shots like Kemba or Napier. Hurley and company waltzed to a national title. The most dominant run in school history, no team managed to even keep it to single digits, a feat which had only been accomplished 4 times in the modern history of the tournament. But Hurley would not rest on his laurels. The 2024 club never dipped below their preseason number 6 ranking, going undefeated at home en route to their first conference regular season title since 2006. UConn announced to the world that, unlike the Ollie era, this would not be a one-off. They electrified MSG, showing their ability to survive shootouts and their ability to power through a rock fight to bring home the Big East tournament title for the first time in a decade. Duly rewarded for their commanding display, UConn received the first number 1 overall seed in the history of the school and cruised all the way back to the national championship game, dominating in a level that even surpassed 2023. Matched up with back-to-back National Player of the Year Zach Edey, surely he had to bring an end to the Husky run of dominance. But Hurley's men were too much. Having already tasted championship glory, they refused to let their appetite go unsated, and for the 9th time in NCAA history, a back-to-back champion was crowned. Victims of spending their first 60 years in small conference basketball, the Huskies still have an incredible resume. Record champions in the Big East, 7 Final Fours, only 1 fewer than Indiana, 6 national championships, level with North Carolina. New blood, true blood, cope with it semantically how you will. UConn is one of college basketball's premier programs, and they're here to stay.